Hi, everyone. Welcome. I know we're going to have people trickling in here shortly. Good. I can see lots of people joining. I'm just going to pull the presentation up here. We're going to start in about 2 minutes, everyone, just to give people time to work their way in. We've got two amazing panelists with you today. I'm going to show you their bios and circle through it just so you get a chance to know us before we get started. I am going to, once we've got more people in, I'm going to ask where people are from. If you want to share where you're dialing in from, feel free to do so, or you can stay silent in the background. So we've got Jesse with us. We're going to ask Jesse and Krista to introduce themselves in a moment, but just while everybody's joining the call, I'm going to filibuster here for a second. Great. Everyone who's just now joining, thank you. Great to have you with us. We're going to get started in just about a minute with a couple intros, and then we'll get into the main event. Great. Welcome, everybody. And we will be recording. You'll get a message as soon as you join letting you know that we'll be recording. So we're not going to ask anybody to speak or anything like that. So if you have questions, please put them in the chat at the bottom. You'll see both chat and Q&A. Feel free to use the Q&A for any questions you have, and we'll answer them live or answer them through the chat. And feel free to use the chat for anything. If you had a question, if you liked what somebody said, if you wanted to add a thought, then feel free to just jump in the chat and add that. If you want to test out the chat, then feel free to open it up right now and just say where you're calling from. I'll do that on my side. This is totally optional. Don't feel like you have to do this. All right, we're going to get started in a moment. Now that we've got quite a few people dialing in. Great. All right, I'm going to first hand the mic to Jessie to introduce herself, and then I'll hand it over to Krista, and then we're going to jump right into the webinar. Jessie, over to you.
Hi, everyone. So my dad actually was diagnosed with Parkinson's when he was 52 years old. And my grandfather, so my dad's dad, was diagnosed when he was 45 years old. And that was a really long time ago because he passed away in 1957 at the age of 50 after undergoing experimental brain surgery to try to treat his Parkinson's. So I knew I had a family history, a very strong family history. So I was actually the first person in my family to take an at-home genetic test about 10 years ago. And so that is when I learned that I was a LARC2 G2019S carrier. So since then, I've participated in quite a few research studies. I used to travel with my dad to go to different research studies. And I've participated in a lot of conferences and symposiums and talking about the subject. And most recently, I'm interested in preventing Parkinson's disease. So I've done a lot of work there trying to get the at-risk population kind of ready for trials that we're hopefully ready to start here in the next year or so.
Amazing. Thank you, Jessie. Krista, I'll turn it over to you.
Hi, my name is Krista. I am a genetic counselor. I've been a genetic counselor for about 8 years so far. And what that means is I have a master's degree in genetic counseling. So I went to graduate school for this. And since graduating, I have been in clinic serving patients with a number of adult neurogenetic conditions, including Parkinson's disease. So I'm really excited to be here and talk with you all today.
Great. All right, I'll do a quick intro of myself, and then we're going to jump into the presentation. I'm Patrick. I'm the CEO and one of the co-founders of Sano Genetics. If you don't know about us, we're a company that provides at-home genetic testing and digital participant engagement tools focused on research. We work heavily in Parkinson's disease and other neurodegenerative conditions. We also work in a wide variety of other genetic conditions. I also come at this from the participant perspective. So we have had a rare kidney disease in my family for as long as I've known about. My dad's had a kidney transplant. A couple of his siblings have. The generation above them all had a smattering of kidney transplants, and it was always a a question for us around the Thanksgiving table or otherwise of what was going on. We'd done a number of genetic tests, and actually only very recently, about a month ago, they found the gene that they believe is responsible. So we're at a slightly different stage of the journey where we've got a gene and it's totally new and there's very little known about it. And obviously this is a story for many genes associated with all kinds of genetic diseases, that there are some that are really well known and understood. And even in a condition like Parkinson's, there's many that are really well known and understood, but there are many more that are discovered every year. So hopefully this discussion today is going to give everyone a little more info about genetic testing as a whole and the role of genetics in Parkinson's, and also some of the really important personal questions that you want to ask yourself and your family before embarking on this kind of a journey. So I'm going to turn it over to Krista, and you just let me know when you'd like to advance.
Awesome. Oh, well, thank you guys so much. So to start off with, I think many of you have probably heard a term that sounds like the new buzzword in the medical field called precision medicine. Now, the reason why precision medicine is so exciting is that it uses personal factors about you to decide how best to treat your medical condition. Now, this is a bit different from the traditional one-size-fits-most approach, where many people are prescribed the same type of blood pressure medication, for example. Now, these traditional methods work well for some health conditions, but for others, we're finding that precision medicine methods that allow doctors to prescribe more tailored medical treatments can be really successful. And they're actually on track to surpass those traditional methods in the next 5 years. One of the personal factors used for precision medicine can be someone's genetic test results. Now, there's a lot of research and even clinical trials testing medications that target specific genes or genetic mutations. These are what we call gene-specific therapies, and they're coming out for a lot of different health conditions, including Parkinson's disease. Next slide. So to start us off with, what is a genetic test? A genetic test looks for changes in a person's DNA. These are often called genetic mutations or genetic variants. And here you can see an example of a genetic variant where in this long DNA code of letters, there is, instead of a letter G at a particular spot in the DNA code shown in blue, someone has a letter A, which is shown in red. Now, I'll have to say having variants in our DNA is really common. It's actually what makes everyone unique. And most DNA variants don't cause any downstream health problems. I like to think of this as the difference between American English and British English spelling. We can spell the word color C-O-L-O-R or C-O-L-O-U-R, but it ultimately means the same thing. Most changes in our DNA are similar to this. There are different ways for the DNA to spell the same message for our bodies. However, some DNA variants do cause changes that can either lead to a health problem or increase someone's risk for a health condition. These are what we call pathogenic variants, or when we use the term mutation. And this is the type of genetic test result that we report out as positive. And so that's what we find when we're thinking about when someone has a positive genetic test result. However, not all genetic tests are the same. There's many different genetic tests out there on the market, and they often differ by what genes they're looking for or what genetic testing technology they're using, which ultimately determines what kind of information they can provide to a person. Many genetic tests are targeted for a specific health condition, like finding out if someone has a genetic predisposition to Parkinson's disease. However, it's important to remember that just because you've had some genetic testing doesn't necessarily mean that you've had genetic testing for all possible genes or conditions. Next slide. So when thinking about Parkinson's disease, we know that everyone has a risk to develop Parkinson's disease during their lifetime. Of the individuals that do develop Parkinson's disease, about 10 to 15% of them are linked to specific genetic mutations in genes like LRRK2, GBA1, Parkin, SNCA, or others. These genetic mutations are passed on from generation to generation, so many times we can see multiple family members who have had Parkinson's disease on the same side of the family. And if you've seen a genetic counselor before, you probably had one of these family trees drawn out that you can see on the right, where we're trying to track that Parkinson's disease through a family. Now, some of these genetic mutations, like the LRRK2 G2019S, are more commonly found in individuals with certain ethnic backgrounds, like those with Ashkenazi Jewish or North African Berber ancestry, although we've seen these mutations in people with many diverse backgrounds. When thinking about which individuals with Parkinson's disease might be more likely to have a genetic mutation, we might ask questions about things like your ancestry, a person's family history, or if someone was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease at an earlier age than we would typically expect. These are things that might tell us that someone has a higher chance to have a genetic mutation running in their family. Next slide. So one question that I'm asked a lot is, if someone has one of these genetic mutations, does that mean that they're going to develop Parkinson's disease someday? And the answer is not necessarily. The reason for this is because Parkinson's disease is caused by a combination of both genetic and non-genetic risk factors. These risk factors come together over a person's lifetime to affect whether or not someone develops Parkinson's disease. This is called multifactorial because genetics is only one piece of someone's risk for Parkinson's disease. So even when someone has a genetic mutation that causes an increased risk for Parkinson's disease, not everyone with that mutation will go on to develop it. The medical term for this that you might see is when a genetic mutation has incomplete penetrance. Next slide. So this can all sound pretty complex, because it is. And so the way that I like to think about this is by using this illustration of a jar. So I want you to imagine that this jar is someone's risk to have Parkinson's disease. That jar can contain both genetic and environmental risk factors. And if the jar becomes full, that's when someone is actually diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. Next slide. Some of these genetic risk factors are known, like LRRK2 G2019S, and they can be identified by genetic testing. However, there are other genetic risk factors that haven't been identified by researchers yet, and so those will not be detected by genetic testing. Similarly, there are some environmental risk factors for Parkinson's disease that are known, while other factors that influence risk are still unknown. You can also see in this example that some risk factors might have a bigger impact than others. So in this picture, the LRRK2 mutation is bigger than the other genetic risk factors. Next slide. Now, we were all born with a certain amount of genetic risk factors for Parkinson's disease, and that genetic risk doesn't change over our lifetime. So whatever we're born with is whatever we have for our entire lifetime, as far as genetics goes. Over time, though, environmental risk factors may accumulate and fill a person's jar. Age or time is a major risk factor for Parkinson's disease. And so here we can see how someone who starts with a higher genetic risk for Parkinson's disease, so the jar on the bottom, requires fewer additional risk factors to accumulate, and therefore is just statistically more likely to develop Parkinson's disease during their lifetime. Next slide. However, it's important to remember that genetic risk factors such as LRRK2 G2019S are just one part of someone's risk to develop Parkinson's disease. Here's an example of someone who has a higher genetic risk for Parkinson's disease, but never develops the condition. So having that increased genetic risk is definitely not a guarantee that someone will develop Parkinson's disease during their lifetime. Next slide. So for some take-home points, genetic test results can have a big impact on you and your family. For those with Parkinson's disease, finding a positive genetic test result might explain why they developed the condition. For those who don't have Parkinson's disease, finding a positive genetic test result might explain their family history of Parkinson's disease, and also might let a person know that they do have a higher risk to develop it themselves. Although, again, it never guarantees that someone will develop Parkinson's disease. And of course, genetic test results can bring those opportunities for precision medicine, such as being eligible for certain clinical trials. Genetic test results can also impact your family. We know that these genetic mutations are passed on through families, so there might be other family members that also have the same genetic mutation. Family members probably approach this risk and what to do with it very differently from you or from one another, and that's okay. I actually expect that family members are going to react differently to this news and might make different medical decisions. So if you're wondering how to apply all of this information to you or your personal situation, I always recommend talking to a genetic counselor, either if you have a genetic test result or thinking about getting genetic testing. Genetic counselors are healthcare professionals who specialize in interpreting genetic test results and can help family members decide if or when they want their own genetic testing. So now I'm going to turn it over to Jessie, who's going to talk more about possible next steps after you have your genetic test result.
Great. And just while we're transitioning, we've had a couple more people join. If you'd like to ask any questions to Krista or Jessie, or just in general, feel free to use the Q&A chat function across the bottom, and I'll turn over to you, Jessie.
Thank you so much, Krista and Patrick. You can put it to the next slide. So one of the things that I think a lot of the first questions when they get a result of a genetic test is, should I share with my provider? Should I share with my family, or should I share with my children? And so I can explain, kind of the things that I went through when I shared my results. It's different for everyone. And it was different for me, I think, because too, I learned about my genetic result 10 years ago. And so the environment was very different 10 years ago than it is now. It was, I think, particularly difficult a decade ago because it was very new, it was very novel. And so I did share my results with my primary care provider and some of my other specialists. But I think it's important to understand that there's this, I think sometimes people expect their family doctor to maybe know more about the genetic results than what their doctor actually knows. And so there's this expectation that if you tell your doctor, they're going to be able to give you a lot more information. And that's probably not true. A lot of times primary care providers, there's millions of genetic variants, and there's no way that they're going to know very specific information on particular variants. So while I do suggest, I think it's a good idea for you to have that kind of relationship with your doctor, that you can have open discussions and that you're not afraid to go to your doctor to talk about results. I think it's important to kind of nurture that relationship, but just be prepared that they may not, you may know more about that particular genetic variant that you're going to discuss with them than they do. And so that can be awkward for some people because it can be kind of flipping the tables a little bit, that you're sharing information that they may not be comfortable with or confident discussing. But again, like I said, I shared it with my primary care physician. I shared it with my family's doctors, like my dad's neurologist, and I shared it with my gastroenterologist, because there's a lot of new information that kind of links the LRRK2 variant between like gastrointestinal conditions like Crohn's disease and as well as Parkinson's. So, and there's a lot of research about gut-brain connection. So it's more than just, I think, your neurologist sometimes that you might want to share those results with. But I think it's important to manage your expectations of what that you're going to actually talk about. So, and as far as sharing the results with your family members, it's important to understand that everyone's different, right? And so, like for me, I tend to like a lot more written information. I'm someone who's very cautious, and I like a lot of detail and a lot of information, and I like time to absorb things, so I'm not one to go right in with the face-to-face communication. I'm one who likes to kind of give me some time. Like I might, it's best sometimes if someone tells me something, but then gives me some time to kind of digest it and to give me some written materials or to give me some resources that I can then research, and then we can come back and have a discussion about it. And so to keep that in mind too, is that when you're thinking about how to approach this with your family, again, everyone's different and your family best. And so to kind of think about how to approach that with them. And then also, as Krista mentioned, everyone is really different, and you're gonna find that there might be some really wide reactions from family members, and all of it is completely normal and everything's okay. And it's not a reflection on anyone, and no one should feel bad or guilty about how they reacted, because everything's very different. Everyone has different personalities, everybody has different life experiences that combine to make the reactions different. And sometimes it can be very different than what you might expect. So for instance, when I first learned, I was the very first person in my family to take a genetic test. So it's very different than the normal situation. Normally you have a proband or you have someone who has Parkinson's disease that actually gets tested, and then the family members learn about it. Well, I did not have Parkinson's disease. I learned I had a genetic variant first. So that was kind of the backwards. So when I first learned that I had Parkinson's, I think a lot of people expected that I would be shocked or sad or, maybe have more negative reaction. And actually for me in that moment, I remembered feeling relief, which was very strange, I think, for someone to think, hey, this person doesn't have Parkinson's, and they just learned that they had a genetic variant. And I had this kind of, it's hard to describe. It was a relief because I knew that if I had a genetic variant, then that must explain why my dad has Parkinson's. And a lot of times there's people who have had a test that was negative, and they've actually they were disappointed because it didn't explain their Parkinson's. I think a lot of times people want a reason, or it's hard to have an idiopathic disease or a sporadic condition. And so they're disappointed with a negative result because, hey, that wasn't it, or, even though there could be a lot more, it doesn't necessarily mean that genetics is not the cause of your Parkinson's disease. It just means that that particular variant is not the cause. But that is why some people, I think, are disappointed when they learn they have a negative result. And then the opposite can also happen. It's completely normal that if you have a positive result, for you to be sad, for you to be shocked or even angry. And so, to allow yourself to feel those things and to give yourself some time. So completely normal. And then, I think too, it's important to understand who you want to share those results with. And, a lot of people talk about, especially if you have adult children, should I share this information with my children? Well, in my situation, I was younger. I was 36 years old. And so I had young children, I had three boys. And so, I obviously didn't rush out and tell them about all of this. However, Parkinson's disease, as I'm sure a lot of people can relate to, it affects the whole family, right? My oldest son, he was born in the same year that my dad was diagnosed with Parkinson's, and my dad lived in our neighborhood. And so we had a very close connection with their grandfather. And so they kind of grew up seeing the whole life cycle of his condition. And so they saw all the good, the bad, the ugly, and it was very normal for them to see the tremors and to see the slowness. And when I learned that I had a genetic variant, I started getting more involved in research and participation. So they were a little bit more exposed than I think maybe other children would have been. And so when my oldest son was in 7th grade, that's kind of when they start learning about DNA and where I'm at in school. And so he had a lot of questions. I mean, children are naturally curious and inquisitive. And in my family, I thought it was very important to have maybe some, to be simple, to not give him too much information that would be overwhelming, but enough information that, it wasn't like I was hiding anything or keeping anything from him, that, he felt very comfortable understanding what was going on. So it was when my oldest son was, I think, in 7th or 8th grade that he learned about my variant because he knew that I was doing a lot of research. So when my oldest son turned 18, he decided actually to get genetic testing done himself. And so my oldest son found out that he does also have the LARC2 G2019S variant. And so he's decided to actually participate in a lot of research with me. So he's 20 now. And so next month, actually, my son and I are traveling to New York to participate in research at Mount Sinai, looking at biomarkers as like an observational study looking at the LARC2 G2019S variant. So it's become very much a family affair in my family. My sister was very on board with, as soon as I learned that I had a variant, of course, my dad was tested and he had the variant, and my sister was also tested. She was very open to having genetic testing done. And it turns out that my sister does not have the genetic variant. And so, she was, I think she had kind of that disappointed reaction too, that she was negative, because she felt like maybe she couldn't participate as much as my dad and I could. But actually my sister has participated in quite a lot of research, because people need, a lot of studies need people that do have the variant and don't have the variant. And so she's participated as a control in a lot of, in quite a few research studies as well. And so that's kind of, been something that my family's done to kind of, I think, cope with the news. So if you want to go to the next slide, Patrick, one thing, a big part of in my family of that, now what? Now that I know that I have a genetic variant, what can I do? And for me, within a week of learning that I had a genetic variant, I was already enrolled in a research study. I mean, it was that quick. I didn't really waste any time. And for me, that's been something that's really helped me to have it's been a very positive experience, because I feel like I'm being proactive. People feel like they're empowered or they're controlled. And that's a lot of how I felt, is that I feel like I can turn this into something good, I guess, that I can, do this for my dad, that I can do this for my grandfather, that I'm doing it for myself too, and for my sons, that by participating in research, that I'm helping the greater good, but I'm also, helping something that has, a very strong connection in my family. And so, like I mentioned before, research studies, a lot of research studies are observational. They're not testing drugs or testing other interventions. And so a lot of the research that I've participated in thus far have been observational. And like with my sister, you don't necessarily have to have a genetic variant to participate as a control, especially in my case. My sister has been my control in a lot of cases in research studies, where you have two sisters one who has the variant, one who doesn't. We both don't have Parkinson's, but how is our biological makeup or biomarkers different between us? And then one way that, I've a lot of times found studies to participate in is that in the US, we have clinicaltrials.gov, which is, a very central place to find a lot of these research studies using key terms like LRRK2 or GBA or Parkinson's. So, I'm happy to answer any questions that anyone has.
Thank you, Jesse. Really appreciate you sharing that story and a really amazing overview. I think we've got a lot of areas we can dive into. There was a question in the chat that I would like to read out that I think also is a broader question that I'd love to hear from both of you. So the question was, I have Parkinson's, but I don't have the LRRK2 variant. What other genetic variants are out there and how would I find out about them? And maybe related to that, Krista, in the work that you do when you're speaking to either a patient or someone who's not yet diagnosed about what the tests can and can't do, how do you approach this kind of situation where the tests are never complete and our knowledge of what's out there isn't complete?
Yeah, that's a great question. And you're absolutely right. We're always learning more about genetics and genetic testing. And so I always tell people to continue to follow up with genetics because we learn things. And so even following up, every year or even every 6 months, we might have something new. And so for someone who doesn't have the LRRK2 variant, how I would approach this is I would, review that person's test to see, well, did they, some genetic tests only look for that specific variant because it's the most common one. And other tests kind of look at the entire gene to look for any possible mutation in that gene. And so I look at that, like, did it cover the entire gene? I also look at, did it cover LRRK2 or did it cover other genes associated with Parkinson's disease too? And so right now there's probably 7 genes that account for most of are the most likely ones we're able to find. But then there's a really long list of other genes that are pretty rare. And so this is something where, I would, talk to a genetic counselor and see, like, have I had comprehensive genetic testing as of today? Is there any updated genetic testing I can look at? Or is there any other information that you can give me just based off of my family history or things like that?
And I would add that there are situations sometimes where you can participate in research to have genetic testing done. So the one that I know about is the PD generation study that is with the Parkinson's Foundation. So they are looking at, I believe they're doing whole exome sequencing, or they might be targeting like the first 7 most common genes, so like LRRK2 and GBA, and I believe they're fully sequencing the 7 genes, right? Mm-hmm. And so besides LRRK2 and GBA, there might be SNCA and some other genes that are of interest. But I believe as part of that study too, if that you're not found to have a variant in one of those 7 genes, they are doing whole genome sequencing, I believe, as part of research. And so you may not get the results of that whole genome sequencing, but that might help further knowledge about what other variants might be out there that maybe in the future we might be able to discover. So.
Yeah, and the only point that I would add to both of those is I think Krista shared this really helpful graph here, and based on my understanding of the disease, and Krista, you can back me up here, that the vast majority of people actually don't have a test that comes back with any really, especially large kind of circled genetic variant here. And this is in part because the research is still ongoing, but it also could be in part because for every disease, whether the jar is filled mostly by genetics or mostly by the environment is different. So there are some cases where a big portion of the risk is driven by genetics, and in others, a big portion is driven by the environment. And for most conditions, we actually don't know. We have estimates of how much is genetics and how much is the environment, but it's actually very common that a genetic test would come back without an answer, which, as Jesse pointed out, could be frustrating in many cases and may not in other cases. Anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think that kind of highlights how difficult it is to interpret that negative genetic test result sometimes. And I feel like in genetics, I really don't get to give people straightforward no's or straightforward answers very often, because, we talked about if you have that positive test result, that doesn't necessarily mean that someone's going to develop Parkinson's disease. And on the flip side of that, if you have a negative genetic test result, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's not quote unquote genetic, right? It could just be that you have a big risk factor that we haven't in a gene we haven't discovered yet. Or we think that there's, might be a combination of smaller risk factors that are just a lot harder for genetics researchers to kind of find them, figure out how they work together in combination. And so that's also something that really the field is we're still trying to figure out answers for everyone else.
Yeah. Thank you. That was a great question. There was another comment in the chat just about an ongoing study at Indiana University that's looking at a number of different genes. And I think this just highlights the point Jesse was making about the availability of research. And maybe, Jesse, you want to add any thoughts to that of what you've gotten out of taking part in research that you may not have gotten otherwise.
Yeah, I think it's I've learned so much. I've learned so much more, and just knowing that I have a genetic variant, I feel like if I ever do have develop Parkinson's, that I would be more prepared. Like, it wouldn't be as shocking, I think, in the moment, and that I would probably be diagnosed maybe earlier. I think it's very frustrating for people to go through a lot of misdiagnoses, and they go through years and not understanding what's wrong with them, and they don't get the treatment early enough. So I think it's been a good thing for me, but everyone's different, and no. I guess another important part is that don't expect all of, if you do share your results with the family members, it's perfectly okay. Don't try to coerce them into something that they don't want to do. If they don't want to have a genetic test, that's perfectly fine, and that's their choice, and they have their own reasons for doing that. And nobody should be shamed, to not want to have a genetic test. And likewise, if I feel like you have a right to know if you want to know, but you also have a right not to know. So, and just to be very careful that we're just respectful of everyone's feelings and wishes.
I wanted to ask a related question. You both talked a little bit about the fact that this is an evolving field and not every healthcare provider or family member is going to have the same level of interest or understanding of genetics. How do you go about having those conversations? Maybe we can start with the first case where you have done a lot of personal research, or you've got a genetic test, but you don't feel like the healthcare providers that you're most closely linked with are as interested in genetics or as educated about it. How, maybe Krista, if we could start with you, how would you advise someone to go about managing that kind of situation?
Yeah, I think Jesse made a great point that there are so many genes and genetic variants that I think setting your expectations that like this might be the first time that your healthcare provider has had a patient with the same mutation that you have. And I think just going in there with an open mind and having the courage to start the conversation is really important. I've heard lots of my patients, kind of commiserate and be like, my doctor didn't really know about this, but they were really willing to learn, or they were, really excited that they maybe heard about something like this in medical school, and then they got to go research for themselves, which is also kind of a weird feeling, for them to be excited about. But I think as long as you have a healthcare provider that is willing to, do their own research, because they're able to go do their own research and learn about this and work with you. I think that's really important. If you have a healthcare provider that seems less interested, I would maybe, try a couple more times and then, think about what is kind of the best healthcare partner that you need, whether that be with, some of your other specialists or other kind of healthcare provider options.
Yes, I agree. And another thing that I did is I made sure that I brought printouts, with, it wasn't just me telling them something. Like I actually had the printouts with where they could go and they could find the information. It had all the numbers and references so that they could go back and look it up themselves and understand the actual technical side of what I was telling them. And it is very interesting to see people's reactions, because I actually went to see a neurogastroenterologist. So it's a gastroenterologist that specializes in neurons, or the inner nervous system within your body. And it was a teaching hospital, so he had a resident with him and a fellow, and he was very excited. Like when I mentioned it, he had come back and he had done all this research already, before he went back to the doctor, and was very excited to learn about it, especially because, like I said, the connection between the gut and the brain. And it was very exciting for him to learn about the LRRK2 variant that he had never heard of. So you do get a lot of doctors that do get a little bit excited to learn something new. And it's, then I feel, the next time I see them, it's more of this mutual kind of, I feel like we're more of a partnership, because, I'm bringing information to them, or what I've learned. And likewise, they bring a wealth of information to me. So I think it can be helpful to share and see where it goes.
We spoke about this concept of penetrance, which is the likelihood that you actually get the disease if you have one of the associated genetic variants. So on one end, if you have the gene, then you are 100% likely to get the disease. It's fully penetrant. And then on the other end of the spectrum, where the gene has very little impact at all, I'm curious to hear from both of you how you approach this concept when communicating with family members that may be younger, and Jesse, in your case, your children and yourself, and also Krista in the work that you do around the decision of whether to get tested, when to get tested, with this penetrance factor in mind, that the test result may be an indicator of risk, but doesn't tell you the whole story.
Yeah. Oh, Jesse, I'm actually gonna let you take this one first.
Well, I just wanted to say, yeah, a lot of people, a lot of people mention, I have more of a chance of not getting Parkinson's than I do getting Parkinson's. I believe the penetrance estimates tend to vary a lot. I think it hovers around 30% on the LRRK2 G2019S a lot of times, depending on your ethnicity. So, so that there's a large part of it that, which I think is very different than, say, in Huntington's disease, where it's 100% penetrant. And so I think that has also kind of helped me have this very positive, optimistic attitude about, hey, I'm going to participate in research. I'm going to learn everything I can about this. And there's a good chance that maybe there might be some interventions to prevent Parkinson's down the road, or thinking more about the environmental, maybe, I've got this genetic risk, but maybe, with exercise or something like that might help. So, yeah, I think that's a very, very important part with point to make sure that everyone understands, like, very upfront in the very beginning, when you learn something about your risk, especially for like the LRRK2 G2019S, and then the GBA variants are typically even lower than that. So I think it's a very important thing to make sure that people understand first, I think.
Yeah, and I think you guys can tell, I think I mentioned that probably 4 or 5 times in, the very short time I was talking, but like, this isn't a guarantee. And I want to make sure that people understand that first and foremost, because you're right, it absolutely changes the conversation about what a positive result would actually mean. I do the same thing. I kind of flip the risk numbers. Like if you have a 25 or 30% chance of having Parkinson's disease, that means that if you test positive, it's a 65 to 70% or 70 to 75% chance that you don't. And knowing that, and for some people that will weigh in and say like, oh, well, if the risk isn't as high as I thought it was, then maybe I don't need genetic testing, or I don't need it right now. Or some people will hear those same numbers and say like, that still seems really high to me, and I would make different decisions if I knew I had that increased risk. And so I really try to focus on kind of what are the next steps that someone would want to take or wouldn't want to take, and try to help them like weigh that into their genetic testing decision. Because sometimes they're like, oh, well, I would want to go take that trip. And I say, do you want to do that anyways? Then maybe that isn't a deciding factor, things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. There was a question in the chat about whether genetic testing results that come from someone like us or someone like Ancestry, DNA, 23andMe, if they can be shared across the platforms, or I'll expand the question a little bit, shared with researchers, and also maybe a little bit about the differences. I can jump in and take this one. One of the things that the vast majority of genetics companies, including us, I think have started to do, which is really important, is the concept of data portability. So you can log in and you can download all of your results, all of your data at any time, and take that with you. And the reason why I think that's so important is because there may be other services that you want to get your data retested or reanalyzed in some way. Not all services allow you to upload data from somewhere else. And I'm going to also flip this question to Krista, because it's really important to consider where the data comes from in the first place. And a test like 23andMe or Ancestry DNA uses a different type of technology that only tests a small part of the genome, compared to some other tests like exome sequencing, which we do a lot of, that Krista mentioned, that's a lot more comprehensive and covers in a little bit more detail. So it's important. The test can tell you about a lot of things, but there's also important to consider what some of the older generations of technology might miss. So maybe Krista, you can touch on that a little bit.
Yeah, I think, the opportunities to move your data around or use all of those different services, I think they're amazing. I also think that it's really important to like know kind of what the caveats are, and kind of, there's pros and cons to all the different testing technologies. And so if you took an ancestry test and, were able to take that data and upload it somewhere, and try to find your risk for Parkinson's disease that way, that might be a little bit more difficult to really give you an accurate picture. And so there are, the rule of thumb in the medical community is that if we find something in your data, in your research data, in your kind of other testing data, we always recommend to confirm that again in one of these medical laboratories if it's, if there's a difference in a testing technology. All that being said, like, it's not your responsibility to know those things. Those are things that genetic counselors know. And so, just being open to bringing all of that information to someone who specializes in genetics, and knowing like we might recommend just to confirm something.
Anything to add to that, Jessie?
No, I think that was well said. Yeah.
Great. Well, I think we have reached a natural endpoint here. I'm just going to put up the final slide here so that you all have our email addresses. If you'd like to follow up with any questions, to say if you liked it, if you had any feedback, anything like that. I'd just like to say thank you so much, Krista and Jessie, for your time. I thought it was amazing. super useful content. You both explained this in a really clear way. And also I'd like to just say thank you to everybody for taking the time to join us here. This has been recorded, so you will get a copy of it. You can share it, you can watch it later. You can delete it if you felt like you've learned everything that you wanted to learn. So thank you again, and we hope you'll join us for one of these in the future.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
All right, bye everyone. I'm going to close the webinar now.